June 4, 1942. Flagship Akagi, 240 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. At 10:26 that morning, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy was steaming through calm Pacific waters, her flight deck crowded with aircraft being rearmed for a second strike. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge, confident that his carrier strike force had achieved another masterpiece of naval warfare. The Americans were beaten, their island base crippled, and victory seemed hours away. Then, in the span of 6 minutes, 3 American dive bombers changed everything. The Akagi had been the most modern warship in the world when she entered service in 1927. Converted from a battlecruiser hull under the Washington Naval Treaty, she stretched 855 feet from bow to stern, displacing over 36,000 tons fully loaded. Her distinctive triple flight deck configuration allowed simultaneous launch and recovery operations, a revolutionary concept that no other navy had attempted. British and American observers watched her trials with a mixture of admiration and concern, recognizing that Japan had leaped ahead in carrier aviation. Yet 15 years later, as flames consumed her hangar decks and secondary explosions tore through her hull, the Akagi represented something else entirely. The story of how a navy's most innovative weapon became obsolete not through enemy action alone, but through decisions made by its own commanders in a single afternoon. The carrier did not fail Japan. Japan's admirals failed the carrier. To understand how this happened, one must look beyond the battle itself and examine the assumptions, the doctrine, and the rigid thinking that turned the world's most advanced carrier into a floating tomb for 267 men. The destruction of the Akagi was not merely a tactical defeat. It was the collapse of an entire philosophy of naval warfare, revealed in the time it takes to drink a cup of tea. The Akagi's story begins not in 1942, but in 1921, when the Washington Naval Conference forced the world's great powers to reconsider how they would fight the next war. Japan had entered the conference as a rising naval power, its ambitions limited only by industrial capacity and raw materials. The treaty that emerged forbade new battleship construction for a decade and imposed strict tonnage limits on each navy. For Japanese naval planners, this was both a restriction and an opportunity. The treaty allowed the conversion of 2 battlecruiser hulls under construction, Akagi and Amagi, into aircraft carriers. While other nations viewed carriers as experimental platforms for reconnaissance and spotting, Japanese designers saw them as the foundation of a new kind of fleet. The Akagi was laid down as a battlecruiser in December 1920 at the Kure Naval Arsenal. Her keel stretched over 800 feet, designed to carry 8 16-inch guns and armor thick enough to challenge any warship afloat. But when the treaty was signed in February 1922, her half-completed hull was redesigned entirely. Where gun turrets would have stood, engineers now planned flight decks. Where armor protected magazines, they built aircraft hangars. The conversion took 5 years. When Akagi was commissioned on March 25, 1927, she bore little resemblance to her battlecruiser origins. Her most striking feature was her unique triple-deck configuration, a main flight deck at the top, a second deck for takeoffs midship, and a third deck near the bow for landing. The idea was efficiency. Aircraft could land while others were launching, maximizing sortie rates. Yet this innovation came with a cost. The multiple decks added weight and complexity, reducing the space available for fuel and ordnance. The structure also made damage control more difficult, as fires on one deck could spread through elevator shafts and ventilation systems to the others. Still, in 1927, these seemed like acceptable compromises for a carrier that could launch and recover aircraft faster than any ship in the world. The Akagi's air group evolved rapidly in her early years. In 1927, she carried 60 aircraft, a mix of torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters, all biplanes with fixed landing gear and open cockpits. By 1935, that number had grown to 66, and the aircraft themselves had become more sophisticated. Nakajima A-2N fighters replaced the earlier A-1N models, offering higher speeds and better maneuverability. Yokosuka B-3Y torpedo bombers carried heavier payloads over longer ranges. Training was relentless. The Akagi's air crews drilled constantly, perfecting techniques for formation flying, dive bombing, and torpedo attacks. By the mid-1930s, Japanese naval aviators were widely considered the best in the world, their skills honed through years of practice that American and British pilots could not match. The carrier's crew worked with mechanical precision, rearming and refueling aircraft in minutes, launching strikes with choreographed efficiency. Yet even as the Akagi's capabilities grew, so did the contradictions in Japanese naval doctrine. The carrier was officially classified as a special type warship, neither battleship nor cruiser, existing in a doctrinal gray zone. Admirals trained in the battleship era struggled to understand how carriers should be used. Some saw them as scouts for the battle fleet, their aircraft serving as the eyes of the combined fleet. Others recognized their offensive potential, but could not break free from the notion that decisive battles would still be won by guns, not bombs. This ambiguity would haunt the Akagi throughout her career. She was built to be revolutionary, but commanded by men who thought in conventional terms. By 1938, the Akagi was showing her age. Her triple-deck configuration, once seen as innovative, had proven impractical. The lower two decks interfered with flight operations more than they helped, creating turbulence and restricting aircraft size. Worse, the arrangement made the ship top-heavy, affecting stability in rough seas. The Imperial Japanese Navy ordered a major reconstruction. Over 2 years, workers at Sasebo Naval Arsenal tore apart the carrier's superstructure and rebuilt her from the flight deck up. The 2 lower decks were removed entirely, leaving a single full-length flight deck that stretched 817 feet. The island superstructure, originally on the port side, was relocated to starboard to match the configuration of newer carriers like Kaga and Soryu. The rebuilt Akagi emerged in August 1938 as a thoroughly modern carrier. Her flight deck could now accommodate 66 aircraft, including the new Mitsubishi A-5M fighters and Aichi D-1A dive bombers. Elevators were enlarged, hangar spaces expanded, and damage control systems improved. On paper, she was more capable than ever. Yet the reconstruction also revealed a troubling pattern in Japanese naval thinking: the belief that technical improvements alone could maintain superiority. While the Akagi's hardware was upgraded, the doctrines governing her use remained largely unchanged. Admirals still viewed carriers primarily as offensive weapons to be concentrated for devastating first strikes. Little thought was given to defensive tactics, damage control in combat, or what would happen if the carrier came under sustained attack. American and British naval observers, studying reports of the reconstruction, noted the emphasis on offensive capability at the expense of protection. The Akagi's flight deck remained unarmored. Her aviation fuel lines ran exposed through the hangar decks, and her firefighting systems were minimal by Western standards. These were not oversights but deliberate choices, reflecting a philosophy that prioritized hitting first and hitting hard over surviving a counterstrike. This philosophy would be tested sooner than anyone expected. When Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Akagi was there, leading the 1st Carrier Division alongside Kaga. Her aircraft struck in 2 waves, destroying battleships, airfields, and fuel depots with brutal efficiency. For Admiral Nagumo and his staff, it was a vindication of everything they believed about carrier warfare: concentration of force, surprise, and overwhelming firepower. The attack itself was meticulously planned. At 6 o'clock a.m., the first wave launched from 6 carriers positioned 230 miles north of Oahu. Akagi contributed 27 aircraft, 9 B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, 9 D-3A Valdive bombers, and 9 A-6M fighters. They arrived over Pearl Harbor at 7:53 a.m., finding the American fleet anchored and unprepared. The results were devastating. By 9:45 a.m., when the second wave completed its attack, 8 battleships had been sunk or damaged, 3 cruisers hit, 3 destroyers destroyed, and 188 aircraft demolished on the ground. American casualties exceeded 2,400 dead and 1,200 wounded. For the loss of 29 aircraft and fewer than 100 men, the Japanese had crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battleship force. Aboard the Akagi, returning pilots described their attacks with exhilaration. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the first wave, reported minimal resistance and perfect conditions. The Americans, he said, had been caught completely by surprise. Officers on the bridge shook hands, certain that they had secured Japan's dominance in the Pacific for years to come. Yet even in victory, there were troubling signs. The attack had missed the American carriers. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were all at sea that morning. Fuel storage tanks on Oahu, containing millions of gallons of oil, remained untouched, and the Americans' repair facilities, the dry docks and machine shops that would prove crucial in the months ahead, were largely undamaged. More importantly, the Pearl Harbor attack revealed the limitations of Japanese reconnaissance. Despite launching from 6 carriers with over 350 aircraft, the strike force failed to locate or destroy the most valuable American assets. This would become a pattern. Japanese attacks were devastating when they found their targets, but the carrier strike force lacked the scouting capability to ensure it was hitting the right things. For the Akagi specifically, Pearl Harbor marked the beginning of a grueling 6-month campaign that would push the ship and her crew to their limits. After Pearl Harbor, the Akagi barely paused. On January 20, 1942, she participated in strikes against Rabaul and Kavieng in New Britain, supporting the Japanese advance into the South Pacific. Her aircraft destroyed Allied airfields and port facilities, meeting little resistance. The pattern established at Pearl Harbor continued. Japanese carriers appeared without warning, delivered overwhelming strikes, and withdrew before the enemy could respond. In February, the carrier strike force turned west, raiding Port Darwin in northern Australia. On February 19th, 134 aircraft from 4 carriers, including 18 from Akagi, struck the harbor and airfields, sinking 8 ships and destroying 23 aircraft on the ground. Australian and American defenders were caught as unprepared as the Americans at Pearl Harbor, unable to mount effective resistance against the coordinated assault. The pace was relentless. In March, Akagi steamed into the Indian Ocean as part of a massive raid against British naval forces. Between March 31st and April 9th, Japanese carriers struck Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, sinking the British carrier HMS Hermes, 2 heavy cruisers, and numerous merchant vessels. British Admiral Sir James Somerville, commanding the Eastern Fleet, retreated to East Africa rather than face Nagumo's carriers in open battle. For the Akagi's crew, these operations blurred together into an exhausting routine. Steam to the target area, launch strikes, recover aircraft, refuel and rearm, and launch again. The carrier operated continuously for 6 months, with only brief pauses for resupply. Maintenance crews worked around the clock, mechanics slept in the hangar decks beside their aircraft, and flight crews flew sortie after sortie with minimal rest. Yet no one complained. The victories were intoxicating. From Hawaii to Australia to the Indian Ocean, the carrier strike force had operated with impunity, sinking enemy ships and destroying airfields across a quarter of the globe. The Akagi herself had steamed over 50,000 miles, launched more than 500 sorties, and lost fewer than a dozen aircraft to enemy action. The crew believed they were invincible. Their officers believed the same. And this belief, more than any technical limitation or strategic miscalculation, would prove fatal. By late May 1942, Japanese naval planners were preparing their most ambitious operation yet: the invasion of Midway Atoll, a tiny island 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. The goal was twofold: capture a strategic base for further operations, and, more importantly, lure the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle that would destroy American naval power once and for all. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, designed the operation personally. He committed nearly the entire Japanese Navy: 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 7 battleships, 15 cruisers, and over 40 destroyers, plus transport ships carrying 5,000 invasion troops. It was the largest naval force Japan had ever assembled, and Yamamoto was certain it would overwhelm whatever the Americans could muster. The carrier strike force, once again under Vice Admiral Nagumo, consisted of the 1st Carrier Division, Akagi and Kaga, and the 2nd Carrier Division, Hiryu and Soryu. Together they carried 248 aircraft, the same force that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Their mission was to neutralize Midway's air defenses, destroy any American ships that appeared, and support the invasion. Yet the plan contained a fatal flaw. It assumed the Americans would not know the attack was coming. Japanese naval intelligence was certain that U.S. carriers were still in the South Pacific, far from Midway. Even if they raced north, they would arrive too late to intervene. Yamamoto's staff saw no need for extensive reconnaissance or defensive precautions. The operation would proceed as all previous operations had: swift, brutal, and unopposed. What they did not know was that American cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese naval code. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, knew about Midway weeks in advance. He positioned 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of the atoll, hidden beyond the range of Japanese search planes. When Nagumo's carriers arrived on June 4th, they would face not a surprised garrison, but an ambush. The Akagi steamed toward Midway, unaware that everything had changed. June 4th, 1942, began before dawn. At 4:30 a.m., the Akagi turned into the wind and began launching the first strike against Midway. 36 B-5N Kate bombers, 36 D-3A Valdive bombers, and 36 A-6M0 fighters. A total of 108 aircraft from all 4 carriers. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the formation southwest toward the atoll, expecting to find minimal resistance. On the Akagi's bridge, Vice Admiral Nagumo and his staff watched the aircraft disappear into the pre-dawn darkness. The mood was confident, even relaxed. This was routine, the 8th major operation in 6 months. Officers sipped green tea and discussed how quickly they expected Midway's defenses to collapse. Yet even as the strike force flew toward Midway, problems were emerging. Japanese reconnaissance that morning was inadequate, limited by mechanical failures and poor planning. Of the 7 scout planes launched to search east and south for American ships, 2 were delayed by engine trouble, 1 had radio problems, and several flew incomplete search patterns. The entire eastern sector, the direction from which American carriers would approach, was poorly covered. At 5:30 a.m., the first strike reached Midway and attacked. The results were mixed. Tomonaga's bombers hit the airfield and damaged installations, but they failed to completely suppress the island's air defenses. At 7 o'clock a.m., Tomonaga radioed back, "There is need for a second attack." This message created the first crisis of the day. Nagumo had held back a second strike force of 93 aircraft, torpedo bombers and dive bombers armed for attacking ships, in case American carriers appeared. Now Tomonaga was requesting those aircraft be sent against Midway instead. Nagumo hesitated. His standing orders were to destroy any American carriers immediately. But no carriers had been reported, and Midway clearly needed additional strikes. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo made his decision. Rearm the second wave with bombs for ground targets. This meant bringing 93 aircraft down from the flight deck to the hangar deck, removing their torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, and replacing them with high-explosive bombs for use against Midway's installations. It was a time-consuming process that would leave the carriers vulnerable, but with no enemy ships reported, it seemed the prudent choice. The rearming began immediately. Maintenance crews swarmed over the aircraft. Mechanics worked to detach heavy torpedoes, and ordnance men wheeled bombs into position. The hangar decks of all 4 carriers became chaotic workshops, with weapons, fuel lines, and equipment scattered everywhere. Standard procedure called for removed ordnance to be returned to the magazines below decks immediately. But in the rush, torpedoes and bombs were simply stacked on the hangar deck to save time. No one thought this was dangerous. After 6 months of operations, the crew had grown complacent. They had never been attacked while rearming. They had never even been located by enemy reconnaissance. The notion that American aircraft might appear seemed remote. At 7:28 a.m., everything changed. A scout plane from the cruiser Tone, the one whose launch had been delayed by mechanical problems, finally radioed a report. 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. On the Akagi's bridge, the message caused immediate confusion. 10 ships could be cruisers, destroyers, transports, anything. Were there carriers? The report did not say. Nagumo demanded clarification, but radio communications were poor, and the Tone scout plane did not respond immediately. For 15 critical minutes, the Japanese carriers continued rearming for the Midway strike while Nagumo waited for more information. Officers argued about what to do. Should they reverse the rearming process and prepare for a naval engagement? Should they launch the aircraft as they were, even though many were now armed with the wrong weapons for attacking ships? Should they wait for confirmation? At 7:45 a.m., a second message arrived. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. This was more specific, but still did not mention carriers. Nagumo's staff relaxed slightly. Cruisers and destroyers were not the main threat. The rearming could continue. But at 8:09 a.m., a third message shattered that calm. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Now the situation was critical. American carriers were within striking range, and the Akagi was in the worst possible position. Her hangar decks were cluttered with aircraft in various states of rearming, Torpedoes and bombs were stacked everywhere, fuel lines were connected, and the first strike force returning from Midway would need to land in less than an hour. The flight deck was needed for recovery operations, which meant the second strike could not launch until those aircraft were safely aboard. Nagumo faced an impossible choice. He could launch immediately with whatever aircraft were ready, but that would be a piecemeal attack with mixed armament, some planes carrying torpedoes, others bombs, none optimally configured. Or he could wait to recover the Midway strike, rearm everything properly, and launch a single coordinated attack. But that would take at least an hour, giving the Americans time to strike first. Doctrine dictated the second option. Japanese carrier tactics emphasized massed, coordinated strikes. Launching a disorganized attack violated everything the Navy had practiced. Nagumo, a traditional officer who had never deviated from established procedures, chose to wait. The carriers would recover the Midway strike, rearm properly, and launch a devastating counterattack. It was the decision that doomed the Akagi. Between 8:20 and 9:18 a.m., the Japanese carrier force came under attack by American aircraft based on Midway. First came obsolete B-26 Marauders and TBF Avengers, flying low and slow, attempting torpedo runs. The Zeros shot them down easily. Then came B-17 Flying Fortresses, bombing from high altitude. Their bombs missed by hundreds of yards. Finally came Marine dive bombers, SB-2U Vindicators, and SBD, Dauntlesses, attacking at steep angles. Again, the Zeros intercepted them, and the ship's anti-aircraft fire drove them off. Not a single bomb or torpedo hit. Every American attack from Midway was repulsed with heavy losses. For Nagumo and his staff, this seemed to confirm their decision to wait. The Americans were attacking frantically but ineffectively. The Japanese carriers, with their experienced crews and superior aircraft, would crush any further attempts. At 9:18 a.m., the Akagi began recovering the Midway strike force. Aircraft landed one after another, pilots reporting damage to Midway's installations, but also noting the need for more attacks. The flight deck was a model of efficiency. Planes landed, were moved forward, and the next in line touched down within minutes. By 9:40 a.m., most of the strike force was back aboard. But as the recovery operations continued, the second wave remained below in the hangar decks, still rearming. The torpedoes that had been removed earlier were now being reattached, as Nagumo had finally ordered the aircraft prepared for attacking ships. The hangar decks were a maze of fuel lines, ordnance, and hurrying crew members trying to complete the rearming as quickly as possible. Above, on the flight deck, maintenance crews refueled the returning aircraft. Aviation fuel flowed through hoses, pooling in small amounts where connections were loose or tanks overfilled. This was not unusual. In the rush of combat operations, small spills were common and considered acceptable. By 10:20 a.m., the rearming was nearly complete. In another 15 minutes, the carriers could launch a full strike force. 102 aircraft, all armed with torpedoes and bombs specifically for attacking ships, escorted by fighters that had already shot down dozens of American planes. Officers on the Akagi's bridge calculated that by 10:45, they would turn into the wind and begin launching. The American carriers would be struck within the hour. At 10:22 a.m., lookouts on the Akagi spotted aircraft high above, approaching from the southeast. They were Dauntless dive bombers from the carrier Enterprise, 37 of them, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey. They had been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour, flying beyond their planned range, nearly out of fuel, when they finally spotted the wakes of Nagumo's ships. McCluskey pushed over into his dive. Behind him, 36 other pilots followed, their aircraft screaming down from 14,000 feet, at angles exceeding 70 degrees. The attack was nearly vertical, giving the Zeros patrolling at low altitude no time to intercept. On the Akagi's bridge, there was no warning. One moment the carrier was preparing to launch, the next, bombs were falling from the sky. The first bomb, a 1,000-pound weapon, struck just behind the carrier's amidships elevator at 10:26 a.m. It penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar, where aircraft were being rearmed. The explosion was enormous, instantly, killing dozens of crew members and igniting aviation fuel that had spilled across the deck. The second bomb hit almost simultaneously, striking near the port aft edge of the flight deck. It punched through into the hangar deck and exploded among aircraft loaded with fuel and armed with torpedoes. Secondary explosions followed immediately as torpedoes detonated and fuel tanks erupted. A third bomb, possibly from another dive bomber, struck the flight deck near the forward elevator. This explosion wrecked the elevator machinery and started fires that spread rapidly toward the bridge structure. In less than 6 minutes, the Akagi was transformed from a functioning warship into a blazing wreck. The hangar decks became infernos, fed by aviation fuel and exploding ordnance. The bombs and torpedoes that had been stacked carelessly during the rearming operations now detonated one after another, each explosion spreading fire and destruction. The flight deck, built of wood over a steel frame, burned fiercely, making it impossible for firefighting crews to approach. From the bridge, Vice Admiral Nagumo watched in horror as his flagship disintegrated. Officers shouted conflicting orders, trying to coordinate damage control, but communications with the rest of the ship had been severed. The Akagi was no longer under control. By 10:46 a.m., just 20 minutes after the first bomb hit, fires had spread throughout the carrier. The engine rooms remained functional, and the ship could still move, but the flight deck was completely unusable. More critically, the fires were approaching the main aviation fuel tanks and bomb magazines. If those exploded, the entire ship would be destroyed. Captain Taijiro Aoki, the Akagi's commanding officer, ordered the magazines flooded to prevent a catastrophic explosion. Damage control parties attempted to reach the lower decks, but heat and smoke drove them back. The carrier had become a death trap for hundreds of men trapped below decks. At 10:50 a.m., Nagumo was forced to transfer his flag. The Akagi could no longer serve as fleet flagship. Communications were destroyed, and the bridge itself was threatened by spreading fires. Staff officers gathered the Admiral's personal effects and code books, preparing to evacuate to the light cruiser Nagara. As Nagumo descended from the bridge, he passed crew members fighting fires with inadequate equipment, carrying wounded comrades, and attempting to save whatever could be saved. Many were crying, not from fear, but from rage and shame. The Akagi had been their home, their pride, the symbol of Japan's naval supremacy. Now it was burning, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The Admiral transferred at 11. As he stepped aboard the Nagara, he turned back to look at the Akagi. The carrier was listing slightly to port, smoke pouring from every opening in the flight deck, secondary explosions still rocking the hull. Around her, the other carriers of the strike force were also burning. Kaga had been hit by dive bombers from Yorktown, Soryu by bombers from Enterprise. In 10 minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers had been reduced to flaming wrecks. Only the Hiryu remained operational, and she would be sunk by the afternoon. The destruction of the Akagi was not instant. She continued to burn throughout the day, fires consuming the hangar decks, the flight deck collapsing into the structure below, and explosions racking the hull at irregular intervals. But as a fighting ship, she was finished at 10:26 a.m. The carrier that had attacked Pearl Harbor, raided Australia, and dominated the Pacific for 6 months was rendered obsolete in the time it took 3 bombs to fall from the sky. As the Akagi burned, Captain Aoki and the remaining crew attempted to save the ship. Firefighting parties worked desperately, but the situation was hopeless. The fire mains had been destroyed by the initial explosions, leaving crews with only portable pumps and bucket brigades. Aviation fuel continued to feed the flames, and the heat was so intense that steel plating buckled and paint peeled from surfaces hundreds of feet away. The most dangerous threat was the ammunition magazines. Despite orders to flood them, some remained dry, filled with bombs and shells that could explode at any moment. Officers calculated that if the main magazine detonated, the Akagi would sink within minutes, taking everyone still aboard with her. By noon, it was clear the carrier could not be saved. The fires had spread too far, and the damage control systems were too primitive to cope with a disaster of this scale. Captain Aoki made the agonizing decision to abandon ship, but even this was complicated. The forward part of the vessel was cut off by flames, trapping hundreds of men. Rescue parties tried to reach them, but were driven back by heat and smoke. Those who could escape climbed down ropes into the water or jumped from the carrier's sides. Destroyers came alongside despite the danger of explosions, plucking survivors from the Pacific. Many men were badly burned, others injured by shrapnel or explosions. Some had been overcome by smoke in the hangar decks and were carried out unconscious. By 2:00 p.m., most of the crew had been evacuated, but Captain Aoki remained aboard. Japanese naval tradition held that a captain should go down with his ship, and Aoki was prepared to follow that tradition. He stood on the burning bridge, watching his crew depart, determined to stay until the end. But the end did not come quickly. The Akagi refused to sink. Her hull was strong, built originally for a battlecruiser, and despite the fire and explosions, the structural integrity held. The carrier drifted, burning furiously, a towering column of black smoke marking her position visible for 50 miles. As evening approached, Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from the battleship Yamato, faced a terrible decision. The Akagi was a total loss, but she was, still afloat, drifting toward American-controlled waters. If she sank in shallow water near Midway, the Americans might recover sensitive materials, code books, radio equipment, intelligence documents. Worse, the wreck itself would be a propaganda victory for the enemy. At 4:50 p.m., Yamamoto issued the order, "Scuttle the Akagi." 4 destroyers were dispatched to sink her with torpedoes. It was a bitter command, ordering the destruction of the carrier that had been the pride of the fleet, but strategically necessary. Captain Aoki, still aboard, was finally persuaded to leave. Officers physically carried him from the bridge to a waiting boat. He wept as he departed, knowing that he was the last to leave a ship that had been his responsibility and his home. The destroyers arrived after dark. At 5:00 a.m. on June 5th, after trying to remove any remaining survivors, they opened fire. Torpedoes struck the Akagi's hull below the waterline, tearing open compartments already weakened by fire and explosion. Water poured in, and finally, the carrier began to sink. She went down slowly, bow first, the stern rising out of the water as the forward section flooded. Men aboard the destroyers watched in silence as the flight deck disappeared beneath the waves, the island superstructure tilting as the ship rolled to port. And finally, with a rush of air and steam, the Akagi slipped beneath the surface. The time was 5:20 a.m. The carrier had survived almost 19 hours after the first bomb hit, a testament to the strength of her construction. But the delay had not saved her. The Akagi was gone, taking with her 207 men who had died in the initial attack or been trapped below decks. With her went the illusion of Japanese naval invincibility. The sinking of the Akagi was not merely the loss of a carrier. It was the collapse of an entire approach to naval warfare, revealed in the span of a single afternoon. The decisions made by Admiral Nagumo and his staff between 7:15 and 10:20 a.m. on June 4th encapsulated everything that was wrong with Japanese carrier doctrine: rigidity, overconfidence, inadequate reconnaissance, poor damage control, and a fatal belief that technical superiority alone could guarantee victory. Consider the rearming decision. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo ordered the second strike rearmed for attacking Midway instead of ships. This was a reasonable choice given the information available. No carriers had been reported, and Midway needed additional strikes. But the decision revealed a deeper problem. Japanese carriers were not designed or practiced for rapid changes in mission. The process of rearming took hours and left the ships desperately vulnerable, with ordnance and fuel scattered across the hangar decks. American carriers, by contrast, had developed procedures for quickly launching whatever aircraft were ready, even if incompletely armed or in small groups. The emphasis was on flexibility and speed, not perfect coordination. Japanese doctrine prioritized massed, coordinated strikes above all else, which meant delays whenever circumstances changed. Then came the reconnaissance failure. The scout plane from the Tone, delayed by mechanical problems, did not report American ships until 7:28 a.m., 2 hours after dawn, when it should have been searching the critical eastern sector at first light. Had the Americans been spotted earlier, Nagumo could have launched his strike before being forced to recover the Midway attack. The entire disaster hinged on a 15-minute delay in launching one reconnaissance aircraft. This failure reflected systemic problems in Japanese naval aviation. Reconnaissance was undervalued, treated as a secondary mission compared to the glory of strike operations. Pilots assigned to scouting were often less experienced, and the aircraft used were often older models with reliability issues. The Japanese never developed the doctrine or technology for long-range, reliable reconnaissance that the Americans would later perfect with radar and better radio communications. The damage control failure was perhaps the most damning. When the Akagi was hit, fires spread uncontrollably because the ship's firefighting systems were inadequate, and her crew was unprepared for combat damage. Aviation fuel lines rot exposed through the hangar decks, ordnance was stacked carelessly, and firefighting equipment was minimal. In 6 months of operations, the carrier had never been attacked, and the crew had grown complacent. American carriers, even early in the war, had better damage control doctrine. When the Yorktown was hit at Midway by dive bombers and torpedoes that should have sunk her, her crew controlled the fires, restored power, and got her underway again in hours. She was eventually sunk by a submarine, but the contrast with the Akagi was stark. American ships could absorb damage and keep fighting. Japanese ships could not. The deepest failure, though, was conceptual. Japanese naval doctrine was built around the idea of a decisive fleet engagement, a single climactic battle where concentration of force would bring overwhelming victory. The Akagi and her sister carriers were designed as offensive weapons to deliver that decisive strike. Little thought was given to what happened if the first strike failed, or if the enemy struck first. The assumption was always that Japanese carriers would hit first, hit hard, and win quickly. This worked at Pearl Harbor, where surprise was total. It worked in the Indian Ocean, where the British retreated rather than fight. But at Midway, the assumptions collapsed. The Americans knew the attack was coming, positioned their carriers for ambush, and struck first. When that happened, the entire Japanese system broke down. There was no doctrine for fighting from a defensive position, no procedures for rapid response to unexpected threats, no flexibility to adapt when the plan failed. Admiral Nagumo himself embodied these failures. He was a competent officer, experienced in night combat and torpedo tactics, but he had never truly understood carrier warfare. His instinct was always to follow doctrine, to wait for perfect information, to coordinate strikes carefully. When circumstances demanded quick decisions and flexible responses, he hesitated. In the critical minutes between 7:28 and 10:20 a.m., Nagumo made no decision at all. He waited, gathered information, and tried to do everything correctly according to established procedures. An American admiral like Raymond Spruance, commanding at Midway, would have launched immediately with whatever was ready. The Japanese admiral, trained in a tradition that valued perfect execution over rapid response, could not bring himself to do the same. And in that hesitation, the battle was lost. The destruction of the Akagi and 3 other carriers at Midway represented the end of Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific. In a single day, the Kido Butai, the carrier strike force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, was destroyed. Japan would never again mount a major offensive operation. The war would continue for 3 more years, but after Midway, it was a slow retreat punctuated by desperate defensive actions. For the crew of the Akagi specifically, the disaster was both a tactical defeat and a profound psychological blow. Many survivors later wrote about the shame they felt, the sense that they had failed not only their ship, but their entire nation. The carrier had been a symbol of Japanese modernity and power, and its destruction shattered the image of invincibility that the Navy had carefully cultivated. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and was aboard the Akagi during the battle, though injured and unable to fly, later wrote, "The Akagi did not fail us. We failed the Akagi. We made her obsolete through our decisions, our assumptions, our inability to imagine that we could be beaten. The Americans did not sink our carrier with better technology or more resources. They sank her because they were willing to adapt, to improvise, to fight in ways we had never practiced. And when the moment came, we could not respond." This was the central truth of Midway. The Japanese lost not because their carriers were inferior, but because their thinking was inferior. The Akagi was a capable ship, well-designed and well-built, but she was commanded by officers who could not break free from rigid doctrine, could not adapt to changing circumstances, and could not imagine that their perfect plan might fail. In the end, it was not American bombs that made the Akagi obsolete. It was the decisions of Japanese admirals in a single afternoon, decisions based on assumptions that proved false, procedures that proved inadequate, and a philosophy of war that could not survive contact with reality. The wreck of the Akagi remained undiscovered for decades. She sank in over 17,000 feet of water, too deep for salvage or even investigation with the technology of the time. For survivors, this was both a relief and a torment. The carrier's grave would not be disturbed, but neither would the questions about exactly what happened be fully answered. In the years immediately after the war, Japanese naval officers who had served at Midway were reluctant to discuss the battle. The defeat was too painful, the errors too obvious. Many blamed Admiral Nagumo, who had committed suicide in 1944 during the fall of Saipan, unable to bear the shame of his failures. Others pointed to reconnaissance failures, mechanical problems, or simple bad luck. But as historians began to examine the battle in detail, a more complex picture emerged. The Akagi was not sunk by chance or by overwhelming enemy superiority. She was sunk because Japanese naval doctrine, carefully developed over 2 decades, proved fatally flawed when tested in combat. The design choices that made the carrier vulnerable, unarmored flight deck, exposed fuel lines, inadequate damage control, reflected a philosophy that assumed Japanese carriers would always strike first. The tactical decisions that left her exposed, the time spent rearming, the hesitation to launch, the inadequate reconnaissance, reflected an officer corps trained for perfect execution but not flexible response. The strategic assumptions that led to Midway, that the Americans could be lured into a decisive battle and destroyed, reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how the United States would fight the war. In 1999, a deep-sea exploration mission led by Robert Ballard discovered the wreck of the Akagi. She lay upright on the ocean floor. Her flight deck collapsed into the hangar spaces, her superstructure intact but heavily damaged. The images revealed the extent of the destruction. The entire midsection of the carrier was blackened and torn, evidence of the catastrophic fires and explosions that had consumed her. For the few surviving crew members still alive in 1999, the discovery brought mixed emotions. Some felt relief that the carrier had been found, her location finally known. Others felt the old shame return, seeing the wreck and remembering how easily she had been destroyed. One survivor, interviewed after the discovery, said simply, "We thought we were the best. We thought our carriers were invincible. We learned otherwise in 6 minutes. Everything we believed was destroyed as quickly as the Akagi herself." This was the legacy of June 4, 1942. The Akagi did not become obsolete because she was old or poorly designed. She became obsolete because the admirals commanding her could not adapt to a new kind of warfare, one where flexibility mattered more than perfect coordination, where damage control was as important as strike power, and where reconnaissance and intelligence could decide battles before a single bomb was dropped. The carrier was a victim not of American superiority, but of Japanese rigidity in an afternoon. The assumptions of 2 decades were proven false, and the ship that had once been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy became a symbol of how quickly supremacy can be lost when doctrine fails to match reality. The story of the Akagi is often told as a tale of American triumph, and it is. But it is also a story of how organizations, even successful ones, can become prisoners of their own success. The Japanese Navy had dominated the Pacific for 6 months using tactics and doctrine developed over years of practice. When those tactics failed at Midway, there was no fallback, no alternative approach, no flexibility to adapt. The admirals who made the Akagi obsolete were not incompetent. They were experienced, professional, and dedicated. But they were also trapped by their own assumptions, unable to question the doctrine that had brought them so much success, unable to imagine that the perfect plan could fail. And when it did fail, it failed catastrophically. 6 minutes was all it took. 6 minutes from the first bomb hit to the moment the Akagi became a floating wreck. But the seeds of that failure were planted months and years earlier, in every decision that prioritized offense over defense, coordination over flexibility, and doctrine over adaptation. The Pacific War would continue for 3 more years, But for Japan, the offensive capability died at Midway. The Kido Butai, the carrier strike force that had terrorized an ocean, was gone. Replacements would be built, new carriers launched, and new tactics attempted. But the strategic initiative had passed permanently to the Americans. And at the bottom of the Pacific, 17,000 feet below the surface, the Akagi lay as a monument to a philosophy of war that had proven inadequate. She was made obsolete not by enemy action alone, but by the decisions of her own admirals in a single afternoon, when everything they believed about carrier warfare was tested and found wanting. The crew of the Akagi understood this, even as they abandoned ship. They knew they had been beaten not by better technology or greater numbers, but by their own inflexibility. As one officer wrote in his diary, recovered years later, "We trained to execute the perfect attack. We never trained to survive an imperfect defense. And so, when the Americans refused to cooperate with our plan, we had no answer." The Akagi was obsolete the moment we stopped thinking and started following doctrine. The Americans sank her, but we made her vulnerable. This was the true lesson of Midway. That innovation and adaptation matter more than technical superiority. That flexibility defeats rigid planning, and that a navy, no matter how powerful, is only as strong as the thinking of its commanders. The Akagi was a fine ship, a product of advanced engineering and skilled craftsmanship. But she was commanded by men who could not imagine failure until it arrived, and when it did, they had no tools to respond. In 6 minutes, from 10:26 to 10:32 a.m., on June 4, 1942, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy became obsolete. The bombs that struck her flight deck destroyed not just a carrier, but an entire approach to naval warfare. And the admirals who made the decisions that morning ensured that when she sank, she took with her the last hope of Japanese victory in the Pacific. For the men who had served aboard her, who had lived on her decks and flown her aircraft, the loss was personal and profound. They had believed in the Akagi, in her power and her invincibility. They had celebrated her victories and taken pride in her achievements. And in one afternoon, they watched helplessly as she burned, knowing that their confidence had been misplaced, their assumptions false, and their doctrine inadequate. The carrier did not fail them. They failed the carrier. And in that failure, they learned what every military force must eventually learn: that success breeds complacency, that doctrine becomes dogma, and that the surest way to defeat is to stop questioning whether the old ways will still work tomorrow. The Akagi was made obsolete not by age or technology, but by the thinking of the admirals who commanded her. In one afternoon, they demonstrated how quickly supremacy can be lost when flexibility is abandoned in favor of rigid doctrine. The carrier sank, but the lesson remained. In war, as in all things, the ability to adapt is more valuable than the ability to execute a perfect plan. When the perfect plan fails, only those who can improvise will survive. And on June 4, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy could not improvise. So the Akagi burned, sank, and took with her the hopes of an empire that had forgotten how to think. The technical specifications tell part of the story. The Akagi displaced 36,500 tons at full load, stretched 855 feet in length, and could steam at 31 knots when her boilers were running at full capacity. Her hangar decks could accommodate 66 aircraft after the 1938 reconstruction, though she often carried more during operations. Her crew numbered 1,030 men, pilots, mechanics, engineers, Gunners, radiomen, cooks, and officers, all working in synchronized precision to launch and recover aircraft around the clock. Yet these numbers reveal nothing about what made the carrier vulnerable. The flight deck was constructed of wood planking over a steel frame, a design that saved weight but burned intensely when ignited. The aviation fuel lines ran exposed through the hangar decks, protected only by thin casing that shattered when hit by explosions. The bomb magazines were positioned directly beneath the hangar spaces, close to where aircraft were armed and fueled, creating catastrophic risk if fires reached them. And the damage control systems, the pumps, hoses, and firefighting equipment, were inadequate for combating the kind of sustained conflagration that followed the American attack. These were not oversights. They were deliberate design choices based on the assumption that Japanese carriers would strike first, destroy enemy forces before they could respond, and never face sustained attack themselves. The Akagi was built for offense, not survival. When forced to defend herself, she had no answer. Consider the crew training. Japanese naval aviators were superb, the best in the world in 1941 and early 1942. They practiced for years before being assigned to carriers, flying thousands of hours, perfecting techniques for formation attack, dive bombing, and torpedo runs. Their skill was legendary, and it showed in every operation from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. But what about damage control training? Minimal. Firefighting drills? Occasional and not taken seriously. Procedures for abandoning ship? Barely discussed. The assumption was always that Japanese carriers would be the ones doing the attacking, not receiving it. When the Akagi was hit at Midway, her crew fought fires with courage and determination, but they lacked the training, equipment, and procedures to cope with the scale of the disaster. American carriers, by contrast, drilled constantly on damage control. Every sailor knew his station, every officer understood firefighting procedures, and every ship carried equipment specifically designed for combating aircraft fires and ordnance explosions. When the Yorktown was hit at Midway, taking 3 bomb hits and 2 torpedo strikes, her crew controlled fires, restored power, and almost saved the ship. She was eventually sunk, but only after surviving damage that would have destroyed any Japanese carrier. The difference was philosophy. Americans assumed their carriers would be hit and trained to survive. Japanese assumed their carriers would never be hit and trained to attack. When reality contradicted these assumptions at Midway, one navy adapted and the other did not. The reconnaissance failure at Midway was systemic, not accidental. The Japanese Navy had never fully embraced the importance of long-range scouting. Reconnaissance was seen as a support function, less important than strike operations, and was often assigned to older aircraft flown by less experienced pilots. The scout planes launched on the morning of June 4th were mostly obsolete float planes catapulted from cruisers and battleships, slow and vulnerable, with limited range and poor radio communications. By contrast, American carriers by 1942 had begun integrating radar, which could detect ships and aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles. They also employed dedicated scout bomber squadrons whose pilots were trained specifically for search operations. The SBD Dauntless, which would sink the Akagi, was both a scout plane and a dive bomber, allowing it to locate targets and attack them in the same mission. The Japanese never developed equivalent capabilities. Radar research in Japan lagged years behind, and naval pilots resisted the idea of using their strike aircraft for mere scouting. The result was that Japanese carriers, despite their offensive power, were effectively blind compared to their American counterparts. At Midway, this blindness proved fatal. By the time Nagumo's scouts located the American carriers, It was too late to launch a coordinated strike. The command structure aboard the Akagi also contributed to the disaster. Japanese naval doctrine centralized decision-making at the highest levels. Admiral Nagumo controlled everything from the flagship, issuing orders that subordinate commanders were expected to follow without question. Initiative at lower levels was discouraged, and officers who deviated from plans, even to respond to emergencies, risked their careers. This worked well when operations proceeded as planned. But at Midway, when the plan collapsed, the rigid hierarchy prevented rapid response. Junior officers who recognized the danger could not act without orders from above. Pilots ready to launch could not sortie without authorization. Damage control parties could not begin fighting fires until formal procedures were followed. At every level, the system prioritized obedience over initiative, creating delays that proved catastrophic. American carriers operated differently. Command authority was more distributed, with air group commanders and ship captains empowered to make tactical decisions independently. When circumstances demanded quick action, American officers could respond immediately without waiting for orders from distant admirals. This flexibility, more than any technical advantage, gave the U.S. Navy a decisive edge at Midway. The ammunition handling procedures aboard Japanese carriers were another critical vulnerability. When the Akagi was rearming her aircraft on the morning of June 4th, removed torpedoes and bombs were stacked on the hangar deck, rather than returned immediately to magazines below. This saved time but created an enormous hazard. When American bombs penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, they ignited not only the aircraft and fuel, but also the ordnance that had been carelessly stored. American carriers had strict procedures requiring all ordnance to be stored in protected magazines, except when actively being loaded onto aircraft. Elevators were used to bring weapons up only when needed, and any delays meant the ordnance was returned below. This made rearming slower, but dramatically reduced the risk of catastrophic explosions if the ship was hit. The Japanese Navy knew about these safer procedures. They had been recommended by engineers and safety officers multiple times. But operational commanders overruled them, arguing that speed of rearming was more important than safety precautions. After all, Japanese carriers had never been successfully attacked. Why slow down operations for a threat that seemed hypothetical? At 10:26 a.m. on June 4, 1942, that hypothetical threat became devastatingly real. The ordnance stacked on the Akagi's hangar deck detonated in a chain reaction, spreading fires that the crew could not control. The time saved by unsafe handling procedures was measured in minutes. The cost was the loss of the entire ship. The destruction of the Akagi can be understood as a case study in organizational failure. Every decision that made the carrier vulnerable, from design choices to training priorities to tactical procedures, was made by rational actors following what seemed like reasonable logic. The flight deck was left unarmored to save weight. Damage control training was minimized to focus on offensive skills. Reconnaissance was undervalued because strike capabilities seemed more important. Ammunition handling procedures were relaxed to maximize sortie rates. Each decision, in isolation, seemed justified. But collectively, they created a system optimized for a specific type of warfare, one where Japanese carriers always struck first, always achieved surprise, and never faced sustained counterattack. When that scenario failed to materialize at Midway, the entire system collapsed. The carrier that had been nearly invincible for 6 months became a helpless wreck in 6 minutes. This was not incompetence. It was the result of assumptions that seemed reasonable but proved false. The Japanese Navy assumed that technical skill and perfect execution would guarantee victory. They assumed that American carriers, if they appeared at all, would be poorly positioned and easily destroyed. They assumed that their own carriers, protected by superior fighters and skilled anti-aircraft gunners, could not be successfully attacked by American aircraft. Every one of these assumptions was proven wrong on June 4, 1942, and because Japanese naval doctrine offered no contingency plans for what to do when assumptions failed, the result was catastrophe. The Akagi and 3 sister carriers sank not because they were inferior ships, but because they were commanded according to a doctrine that could not adapt when reality diverged from expectation.